So, Lisa Cron, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
It is a pleasure to be here.
I am so glad to have you. I really am a fan of your work. And I think before we start talking about story and being wired for story, I'd love to get your origin story because you have an interesting background. I'd love to find out how you got into this whole field of writing and talk to us sort of when you first decided that you wanted to follow writing and books and stories as your calling.
Um, that's do we have 3 hours to talk
I
about
know,
it?
yeah. We'll do the abbreviated version, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly wanted to be a writer. I left
Mhm.
when I graduated college, I went to school at Berkeley, moved to New York, immediately wanted to get into publishing. Um, and what I realized is from reading and from, I mean, I worked with story and with manuscripts. I mean, frankly, as I'm fond of saying, like for more decades than I want to admit to being alive.
Yeah.
And and sort of in that time, what I realized very quickly was I didn't really want to be a writer. Myself, and it's funny because when people hear the word writer, they tend to think of like someone in a garret in Paris with a beret and they're writing
Mhm.
novels. But
Right.
writing is so much more than that. And writing isn't even, here's the thing I realized, writing isn't about writing. It's about
Interesting.
story. It's the biggest, as I am fond of saying, I say this to writers, and I'm getting off track, I know, but as I say this
No.
to writers all the time, the writers I work with, I say, if the world that gave advice to writers was a person, and what I used to say was, I'd punch it in the nose and go to jail happily, which is a metaphor. I don't want to go to jail. And then I realized I have to be stronger. And I said, I'd punch it in the face and go to jail happily because everything it says is really, I really think, 180 degrees wrong. And now what I say is, the shower scene in Psycho?
Yes.
That is how I would go after the writing world because it is not about writing. It is not about the muse. It is not about having talent. It is not about being a wordsmith. It's about telling a story, and story is very different. And what pulls us into a story is massively different than what we've been taught, and what just seems logical when we're reading. And that's to get back to your question. That's what started to pull me in because as I read manuscript after manuscript, and I read in publishing, and then I read for the studios for years, books to film
So
mostly.
you were an editor, right, for a little while, or you worked as an editor?
I worked. I know I never actually edited. I did a little bit when I was in when I worked in John Muir Publications in Santa Fe. I did everything there. I acquired, I
Yeah.
edited, I did subrights because it was a very small place. Um, but I did a lot of publicity and subsidiary rights.
So
But
how
then,
are you reading the manuscripts? In
yeah.
what
So then,
capacity?
oh well, like for instance, when I first went to work at Norton, anybody could read. Like it didn't matter what. Like I went in, and my first job there was in publicity. But if you
Hmm.
wanted to read manuscripts, you could, and you got a. At that point, it was like
The
it was.
slush pile, right? There was just so many. Yeah.
Yeah, Norton was one of the few houses actually that still looked at a slush pile, and
Mm.
you'd get a certain amount of money to to take it home and read it. So I started reading then. But when I was really reading, I mean, the place where I worked in TV for a while also, but when I was reading for the studios, I mean, that was the place that it really hit me because that was my job at that point. I mean, I was reading, 4 or 5 manuscripts a week. And it wasn't
Mm.
just reading them to say, are they good or bad, value judgment, or could this be a movie or not? I had to say why. And what I realized, I mean, both, throughout my entire career, but especially then, was that what I'd been taught pulled you in. What I'd been taught that writers are supposed to do was just completely untrue. That what actually was riveting us was something entirely different. It had nothing to do with being a quote unquote good writer or writing well by, writing standards. And that's where things, turned around for me because no one was teaching that. No one
Mm.
was talking about it. And luckily for me, sort of at that point, neuroscience, not only was neuroscience burgeoning, but so was the internet. So
Yeah.
I went from thinking, wait, this is my theory of what pulls us in. This is my theory of what a story is. This is my theory, therefore, of what you need to go and do in order to have something to say, to, no, wait, this is hard science. This is how we actually process information. This is what is actually pulling us in, not what we've been taught pulls us in, which is why I want to go after the writing world with basically whatever kind of knife Norman Bates had. I want that because they're just wrong. And because the internet was burgeoning at that point, I could read, like an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the New Yorker that would quote some, scholarly paper or even PhD thesis. And if you're intrepid, online, within 5 minutes, I could be reading the original source material. And
Hmm.
so it was really, and that's how I ended up writing Wired for Story and then Story Genius and my most recent book, Story or Die, all goes into the biology behind it and how to do it. But really, the reason why, because it's not just about story in terms of writing or being a good writer, but we've been sold a bill of goods for, oh, I don't know, 2,000 years, thanks to Plato, bless his heart, and I mean that in the purely Southern sense,
Hmm.
in terms of how we process information and the way that we look in the world and why we're making the decisions that we're making and ways in which we are cruel and unempathetic to ourselves and that we blame ourselves and shame ourselves that just has to do with our wiring. We're wired to live in a world we don't live in anymore. And so many of the ways that we look at things and that we're told don't do that or you have low self-esteem or just has to do with wiring. It does not have to do with anything we're doing wrong.
Hmm.
So long way to answer.
Yeah, no. And there's a lot there. First of all, if I ever stay at your house, remind me not to take a shower there because you're very into the psycho imagery. I'm I am going to stay away from showers. Um, but I think, to step back a second, I think it's important for us to understand what you mean when you say story, because I think the first misunderstanding happens is I think people don't really understand what we mean. It's so trendy right now to say storytelling and stories, and I think people have, I don't know, like when I think of story, and this is somebody who's written stories his whole life, not his whole life, but his whole adult life certainly. I sometimes when I hear story, I'll think of like a beginning, middle, and an end. I'll think of like sitting down and hearing a story, when I was a kid, or what's the plot. And I know, what do you mean when you say
Okay.
story?
And that's the biggest, just even because people are taught that a story has a beginning, middle, and an end. How does that help you? What doesn't?
Hmm.
Show me something that doesn't. Like, what does that mean? A story is this. To put it in the smallest nutshell, a story is about how somebody confronts a problem they can't avoid, and something in their belief system has to shift in order
Hmm.
for them to either solve the problem or see it as something very different than they thought it was in the beginning. That's what a story is. It's not about the plot. I can't say that strongly enough. And I know I don't like using these words anymore because I used to say if it was up to me, I would burn. And now with all the book burnings, it's like I don't want to be associated with that. But I would burn every story structure book from, the much revered and deeply misogynist Hero's Journey all the way up to the most popular one now. Because first of all, it's a misnomer. Those are story structure. It's not. It's those are not story structure. They're plot structure, and it's
Hmm.
not about the plot. Story's internal. It's not external. Everything in a story gets its meaning based on how it's affecting the protagonist in the moment on the page as they're struggling with what to do. Every protagonist comes into this story with a fully formed agenda already there. There's so much work you need to do before you get into writing, page one, because all stories begin in medias res, meaning in the middle of the thing. So if
Hmm.
you start on page one and go forward, in the middle of what? There's so much work that needs to be done before, because if you don't mind my saying, the biggest lie that the writing world tells us, here's the writing world's, in my opinion, biggest lie.
Hmm.
Use backstory sparingly, and then only when the reader needs to know something. Because first of
Hmm.
all, you never put anything in because the reader needs to know. Not that they don't, but that's not why you put it there. You put it there because the protagonist is struggling with what to do, and they're trying to figure that out. The command center of your novel is your protagonist's internal struggle, is that internal voice as they're trying to figure out what choice to make, because every scene, is going to have them ask them to make a difficult choice as they try to bring their agenda to fruition. So, backstory is what we use to make sense of what's happening in the moment. And without backstory, all you've got is the generic. All you've got is surface. And we don't come for surface. We don't come for what? We don't come from the plot. We come for why. Why is that character doing that? And that always comes from the past. In fact, backstory is where all story logic comes from. Because story logic doesn't come from the plot. Story logic comes from the internal, evolving, subjective narrative that your protagonist is using as they're making sense of what's going on. The meaning they're reading into it, not some intrinsic meaning in what's going on. Because as I think we all know, especially in the past 10 years, if you look at facts on the surface that are things that are happening, we all are going to read very different meaning into that. You got to know what that is. And then that's on the page. It's on every single page. So that's not pre-work. That's not work that you do that before the real writing comes in. That is the real writing. I mean, I was working with a writer who said, I want to see that. So I'm going to get out my highlighter and I'm going to highlight everything that's that internality, meaning the character trying to figure it out, and backstory, because that's where it comes in. And she came back the next week and she said, oh my God, I'm halfway through. And she was reading Sharp Objects, which is Gillian Flynn's first, who wrote
Yeah.
Cron. And she said, I'm halfway through the book and I've highlighted 60. That's 60%. 60% of that book was backstory and this internality, which is how it came out. I said that to a client, because I say it to everybody because it's so true. A couple of weeks ago, a guy who's writing a YA fantasy, and he said, "Yeah, that sounds really interesting." And he came back to me a week later and said, "I wanted to test it out. I got out my highlighter," and he said, "I reread the first Harry Potter, and you're absolutely right. 50 to 60% of his backstory, and that internality is Harry's trying to figure out what to do. Story lives and breathes there. That's what stories are about, and that's what you have to create first, or you have no story. Story's an
Right.
internal thing, not an external thing. You can't start on page one and go forward."
Right. You can have the structure, but if you don't have the internal conflict, right, then you're just going to have kind of an empty shell of a tale. Or I mean, we see this a lot in movies, or like especially like sometimes like superhero movies, or like rehashes of movies that have come out. Like version 7 is that they have the hero journey structure, but without the sort of internal emotional story, you've got nothing. And then sometimes they'll try to tack it on. I feel like at the end, like he needs a love interest, or he needs to have a problem with his parents, or they'll try to track on some sort of human element, but it doesn't work because it has to. I'm sure it just drives you crazy. But I see
Yeah.
it a lot. And I feel like when people don't connect with the story, that's kind of probably one of the main reasons is they're not connecting internally with the protagonist, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's something. My son is a filmmaker, and I remember him calling me once when he was in film school, and he'd just gone and he'd gotten an internship. This was, I guess, about 12 years ago, at the Weinstein Company, when there was a Weinstein Company.
Hmm.
And he'd just come from a place where it was a very small company, and they read everything that came through the transom, and he'd written coverage, I don't know, for maybe 50, movies. And he said, I got to tell you about the difference at the Weinstein Company. He said, I got there today, and the guy's going to work he said, I've been out sick, but I just read these 4 scripts of what we're doing, just so you get an idea of what we're looking for. And he said, the difference in the scripts, he said, it wasn't that they were better written, but exactly that. He said the scripts that came into the other place, big things happened, but it didn't matter to anybody. It was just a bunch of things that happened. The Weinstein Company, it mattered to somebody. I mean, his way of saying it, they were making a movie recently, and he said they brought not at the Weinstein Company, obviously, but the place where he's been for about the
Hmm.
past 7 years. He said, we had to bring the film, the screenwriter back in because we needed more backstory, because the story present is what makes the unconscious conscious. And he did not mean that in a Freudian, Jungian, or God forbid, woo-woo sort of way. He meant that's what we've now inculcated as this is how I see the world. This is the meaning I read into it. This is just like life. I mean, this isn't a writing convention. This is how our brains work. And now something happens that challenges that belief that we've got that's so deep that we don't even think it's a belief. We just think it's the way the world is. And we have to question it. That's what stories are about, questioning that and having to change it, because what's happening in the plot is forcing us to do that. The plot is there, and the point of the plot is to affect the protagonist, to make that change within the protagonist. Otherwise, you have, as I'm fond of saying, I can't tell you how many manuscripts I've read where if you asked me, what's it about? I'd go, it's about 300 pages. I have no idea. Just a bunch of things that happen. And that's what, I mean, scripts even more so. They're harder because people think they're easy. They're way harder,
Yeah.
you
And
know.
it's a visual medium, right? So I would imagine in a script it's hard to get to the internal because you're it's a medium that's so based in the
Yeah.
external and what you're seeing. I know having written both that that
Hmm.
can be tricky. Let's talk a little bit about the biology
Sure.
facet here too, because what is it about our biology as humans that makes us attracted to stories as a way of communicating and getting information across and being persuaded?
Okay, here's the thing. It's not that we're attracted to story, it's that we think in story. I mean,
Okay.
there's no other option. I mean, story is literally built into the architecture of the brain. If you give someone a fact and they can unpack it, anything that happens, and they can unpack it, meaning they know what it means. And unpack doesn't just mean they know what it means in general or, in a neutral way, because those facts go right over our heads. We don't care. The thinking part of our brain is there for something that's going to affect us. So when we get something that we can unpack and we can see boots on the ground, the consequence it is going to have on our lives or the lives of somebody who we care about, our question, all of us, is how is this going to affect me given my
Hmm.
agenda? Is it going to help me or is it going to hurt me? And we unpack everything and judge it based on that particular narrative. It's literally how we're wired. So that everything comes in that story form, meaning putting it into context. How is it going to affect me? How is it going to affect my belief system, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, we could go into there's our biology is so fascinating and so different than what we've been taught. Can I give you just a really quick
Sure.
example of something we've got backwards, going back to um, that notion of Plato, right? So the cornerstone of Western civilization, of how we make sense of things, right? This is the difference is logic, right? Plato said, if you want to make a decision, you've got logic, you've got reason. That is the white horse, he called it, and that's how we decide everything. Over here, we've got the black horse, which is
Hmm.
emotion. And you want to stay away from emotion because emotion's sole goal is to subvert reason, right? That is the goal of emotion, is to subvert reason. And what we know now is that is not true. Every decision we make based on how we feel about something. It isn't binary. It doesn't go the other way where to hell with logic or reason. But those two things come together. It's both and, because emotion is the decider, because emotion is what tells us what things mean. Emotion telegraphs meaning. That is the point of it. The way there's nothing that ever happens to you that you think
Hold
about.
on one second. You
That,
froze.
oh no.
Oh no. Okay.
Oh,
Emotion tells you what
yeah.
stories mean. Right.
Emotion tells us what things mean to us. I mean, how we feel about it. It's not some nebulous thing. Emotion telegraphs meaning. It was a survival mechanism. So you have to sit down and think about it. I mean, now when we think of emotion, it's been so. I mean, I mean, it's been so. I'm trying to think of a word that I can use that doesn't. I mean, it's been so used against women. Let's face it.
Hmm.
Misogyny is what really takes emotion. Women are emotional, men are logical and rational,
Right.
and so any even show of emotion at any time means you're emotional, and that's a negative. And the irony is, if you couldn't feel and process emotion, you couldn't make a single rational decision. I mean, that's biology. That's not a hyperbole. That's biology. I can give you a quick example if you like.
Hmm.
Okay, so there's a neuroscientist. I think he teaches at USC here, Antonio Damasio, who's written several books, and he writes a lot about a patient he had, a guy by the name of Elliot. And Elliot was one of those like pillar of his community kind of guys, right? He had
Hmm.
great family, great job, um, uh, but he also had, very sadly, a brain tumor. It was benign, and the surgeons got all of it, but they had to take some of his prefrontal cortex, which I'm assuming is here. I don't. It's his prefrontal, so I'm doing this. I don't know where the prefrontal cortex is. But it's somewhere in our brain.
It's somewhere in the prefrontal area. Yeah,
Yeah,
the front.
exactly.
But pre,
Yes,
yeah.
it is here. That's my guess. But they had to take a bit of it, and so when he recovered, he was physically completely hale and hearty. But his life fell apart. He'd lost his job, he'd lost his family, he was like on the couch at his parents. The government was saying, dude, what are you doing? You were a productive member of society. Are you like a malingerer? And his parents wondered that too. And they were about to, cut off his disability. So his parents, went to Damasio and said, yeah, what is going on here? And Damasio ran a battery of tests, and what he discovered is that Elliot had lost the ability to feel and, importantly, process emotion. Now,
Hmm.
here's the interesting thing. He's still tested in the 97th percentile in intelligence, in facts. He could enumerate any solution, a number of solutions to any problem you could pitch at him. He just couldn't pick a solution. Like he'd go
Right.
into his office in the morning and go, like, should I do that thing my boss really wants me to do? Or, look around, maybe, how about if I like re-alphabetize my file folders again today? And if I do the file folder thing, the blue pen or the black pen at lunch, like he go to
Couldn't
restaurants
make
and
choices.
menus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Couldn't
he couldn't
decide.
choose anything because emotion is the decider. And that's biology. That's a fact. That's not
Mm.
hyperbole. That's not metaphor. That's fact.
That's interesting because you would think like if you were a scientist, yeah, you're working on science and facts and reason. So like two plus two equals four. That is a fact. There emotion in the sort of decision that two plus two equals four, and when you're sort of following the facts. I'm just trying to. It sounds great what you're saying. I'm just trying to imagine. I'm trying to play devil's advocate here.
I'll go for it.
Is there a time when being just having your rational mind operate is also advantageous?
I'm
Like
not saying, I'm saying that you can't have, that it's always both and.
I
I
see.
mean, always both and. It's never, I mean, it's not like you just do what you feel because you're going to think about it
Yeah.
too. But
Because
at the
otherwise
end,
you just go, yeah, you just you do
right,
anything you want to do. That's also kind of destructive, right? Just doing
right.
everything. Yeah.
Because you're thinking, I mean, I think the biggest lie they tell us on one, not, I say that, there are a lot of biggest lies out there.
Yeah, a lot of
But
lies.
yeah, exactly. But the people, the people are learning for learning's sake, and nobody does that. We learn because we're interested in it, because there's a context that gives it meaning for us in our lives. So sure, there's math, but I would say even those people who are doing, whatever, you see those pictures of like there's a board in the entire, room, and the entire wall is a blackboard, and there are all these numbers and symbols that, us normal people go, is that a design? I don't know what that is. But there's the thrill in I'm going to be the one that figured it out. There's the thrill that this really matters, and then the practical application of that, which is boots on the ground. How is that going to affect other people? That's what we're always looking for. That never goes away. So yeah, it's always, and what story does is it puts it into a context that has meaning for us. And without that, you just get facts without thinking of the consequences of those facts. I
Right.
mean, we could launch into politics right now. I've been thinking about that a lot with hearing about the cases that the Supreme Court is about to take up. And it's terrifying because looking at some very small factually going, well, this is the fact, and the founder said this, and therefore, we're not going to fund anything that Congress doesn't fund every year because it says it, blah, 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 without looking at, okay, first of all, you're misreading that. But second of all, if you take that away, look at all of the consequences it's going to have on the entire economy. But that doesn't matter. All that matters is this one rational, logical thing. And when you look at what it's going to do to the economy, it isn't just facts. It's you're feeling those facts because it's going to affect you. It's going to affect the people that you love. It's going to affect the world. And so you get that feeling in your stomach. I mean, there's so many interesting things about that in terms of the fact. Here's an interesting, fun fact. When somebody says something to you that fights with what you believe, that contradicts something that you believe, especially if it's a core belief and it's something that hues you
Hmm.
as a tribe, you get angry. You don't get angry because you're pig-headed or stubborn or tragically misinformed, which you certainly might be. You get mad because your brain has done it for you. Because we are wired to take something that is going to contradict our belief system and what hews us to our tribe. It travels the same neural pathways as if somebody came up and was threatening you with a baseball bat. Fun
Mm.
fact, when somebody challenges your belief system, blood rushes to your thighs. in case you need to make a quick getaway. And that's just how we were wired. I mean, then we could go into the 100,000 years of the wiring way
Well, it's
back
how we're
then.
wired, but it's also, and then we use cognitive bias or whatever, right, to justify what we believe is true, right? So we tell ourselves stories, and we've told ourselves a story that is the belief that we have in our world. And if somebody tells us a different story, sometimes, yeah, you're like, no, that's not the story I believe. So I'm going to make whatever you said adhere to my story, the story that I've told myself,
Okay, well,
right? I mean,
so yes and no. Yes, but there's one thing, and this is like I love Brene Brown, but she says it that way
mhm.
too. And the one thing I would really disagree that I think you're 100% wrong on is just basically what you said is so, but it's that we tell ourselves a story. We do not. We do not tell ourselves a story. The story that we live in is the story that our lived experience has taught us. Because it sounds like we have a choice. I could tell myself this story, I could tell myself that story, I pick this one. That is not true. Our lived experience tells, that's why you got to do backstory for characters. I'm story specific backstory, not general backstory
Yeah.
for characters, especially your protagonists, but all characters, because your past experience taught you that those things were true. And so it was inculcated in your brain as permanent, not as a choice. And the reason for that, if you don't mind, can I go back to one more one more brain science
Yeah,
thing?
please do.
Okay, so like I said, we're wired to live in a world we don't live in anymore. Because when our brain wiring came in, the last big growth spurt, right, that we had, I'll tell you about 150, about 100,000 years ago, 50, and that was when, for a long time, they thought, evolutionary biologists said it was when we got the ability, to think analytically, and that's true, we did. But they know now that it's also, and the real reason for it was because that's when the need to belong to a group became hardwired into the way
Hmm.
that we saw things. So we have that biological need to belong to a group. And at
Hmm.
that time, when we were going to, try to figure out how to live in the world didn't change. The group that we were going to hew to wasn't now self-selecting. It's like, think about Dunbar's number, right? Robin Dunbar from Oxford, right? His Dunbar's number is 150. In other words, and from then to now, we
That's 150 friends that you have or people that, yeah.
yes, exactly. 150 people up to tangentially. That is, our brains have evolved to be able to. Back then, it wasn't like it is now. Now we can pick out of billions of people, those 150 people. Then it was 150 because, dude, that's all there is. So
Hmm.
that was it. And also, the world we lived in did not change, right? I mean, if you were born 100,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago, it was the same. There's no religion, there's no, other people, there's no countries, there's no buildings, there's no, like a squirrel. If a squirrel was born 500 years ago in a forest and 100 years ago in a forest, it's the same forest. They do the same stuff. So evolutionarily, that's a word, it made complete sense that once we learned something, it became encoded as that is the way the world is. And we're still wired that way. So my point is we don't tell ourselves that story. And this is where I think we have to be so much more empathetic to ourselves. We didn't make that choice. That's not a flaw. That's maybe a flaw in our wiring, but not in us. We're not doing anything wrong. Doesn't make it easy to change it, but it just means we shouldn't blame ourselves for it. The same, I remember once hearing on a it was actually here was Madeline Brandt used to have a radio show on
Hmm.
a KCR or KPPC, I think it was. And I remember that she was talking to somebody about how everybody wants people to like them because they're so insecure. They have so low self-esteem. And I was screaming this was back in the day, it
The
was before it
radio.
was actual radio, right? I was
Yeah.
like, no, it's not about that. We are wired to want everybody to like us because we're wired for a time where if they didn't, they could clobber us and throw us over a cliff. That doesn't make you insecure. It doesn't give you low self-esteem. We want everybody to like us, down to the barista at Starbucks. It's just what it's what we come into this world with. And when we shame ourselves for that, we're doing double duty. In other words, we're doing double shame because we already feel bad about something that we're doing, and now we feel even worse because it's our fault and it proves that there's something wrong with us. And it's often things that we can't change because change is hard. It's really hard.
I mean, can we, but yeah, but can we change our wiring some? I mean, I know that as humans we're wired a certain way, but can we change the way we think, or are we just so hardwired to think a certain way that it's almost like hopeless?
I think
You know?
some things are hopeless, but I think you got to
Right.
wanna and really be conscious. I remember hearing, I can't remember what his name was. A friend of mine was having an LA-based mystery writer who's also a therapist, and I can't remember who it was because I didn't read his stuff.
Hmm.
She's like, "I need to fill seats. Will you come and listen?" So I did. And the most interesting thing he said was that people always blame their mothers, but whatever. That
Mhm.
because of his mother, he always, and I forget, it was some way he looked at women that was unfair to women, unfair to him, and he said, "I know that I'm always going to have that feeling." And it's going to grab me. And he did this. He like grabbed the front of his shirt. He said, "I know that's going to be there. But because of that, when that happens, I have to consciously go like this and throw it away." It's really hard to unlearn it because when we learn what to be afraid of, it gets relegated down to that cognitive unconscious where most of our decisions are made. I mean, that's why it's not the story that we tell ourselves. It's the story that it's just the way that we see the world. And our brain
Yeah.
steps forward and wants to protect us. Our brain's doing it all the time. I mean, the example I use, and this isn't, bad things that are being done, but it's like, when you're driving down the freeway and we're here in LA, and, let's imagine that for 1 minute, the 405, you can't sail down it. And then all of a sudden you see that sea of red. And if your conscious brain had to figure out what to do and think about it, because conscious brain is really slow, it would go, "Oh, wait, there's that sea of red. If I look into my memory banks, that means those cars are going slow. No, upon further study of my memory banks, they might be at a dead stop. And, with some empirical, I'm going to look up empirical research, they are at a dead stop. And a little more empirical research, I'm going really fast. I guess I better put my foot on the," and by the time you'd be, impaled in the car in front of you, you don't think about it. Watch next time when you're driving and that happens, your foot is going to be on the brake before your conscious brain has caught up with it. That's what our
Hmm.
cognitive unconscious does, which is good because studies show that we make, are you ready for this? 35,000 decisions a day. And
Mm.
of those 35, we're consciously aware of, I don't know, I think 70. And I'm convinced
Right.
most of those are on the level of like, should I wear the blue socks or the red socks? Like, who cares?
Yeah. It's
So,
amazing. Yeah, it's true. We're constantly, am I going to reach to grab this water to have a sip? Am I going to
yeah, I
ask the
mean,
next question? Yeah.
exactly. And those
We're-
decisions, I think, are a lot of like the keys on the typewriter. How do you spell? I mean, that's what makes up the 35,000. So,
I mean, that's the crazy thing. If there's so many, we're bombarded by so much. I think you had another statistic in your book, Wired for Story, about how we're bombarded by so much input all day, but our
11,
brain is able to
yeah.
filter. What is it? 11?
11 million pieces of information to our five senses every second, and of those, we can tangentially be aware of 40. And on a good day, we can concentrate on, or look at maybe seven. It goes down to way single digits. And on a bad day, as we know, good luck with maybe three, and we're probably wrong about those three that we're looking at. Yeah, I mean, everything is done by our cognitive unconscious because we have, from birth on, what's known as an avidity for patternicity, which is why you never want to use $25 words. What the hell? But it means we're looking for,
Divinity for pattern is it? Whoa. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah. What does that
exactly.
mean?
It means we're instantly looking for if this then that patterns. And once we see
Hmm.
an if this then that pattern, if I cry real loud, that nice person's going to give me milk as a baby. You don't think about it anymore. It goes into your cognitive unconscious. And that's what stories are. That's why it's a problem you can't avoid. Stories are about, I thought this one thing was going to happen, and something else happened instead. How do you
Mm.
deal with something where your cognitive unconscious doesn't know what to do, or what it thinks you're supposed to do is just going to get you into more trouble? Because that's what stories are. I mean, think of story as the world's first virtual reality. I mean,
Mm.
that's why I'm so fond of going like stories of world's virtual reality. That notion that we get now of let's be always in the present, always in always in the now. I mean, I don't care what any new age guru or Eckhart Tolle says. Being in the now all the time is a really bad idea. Because if you were, you'd have no idea the dangers or delights that are waiting for you, around the corner. That would be awful. Story
Yeah.
allows us to experience things we haven't experienced. I mean, they've done fMRI studies that show when you're lost in a story, same areas of your brain light up as if you were doing what the character's doing. I mean, we really are there. it really takes us out of the real world and puts us into the world of the story, which is one of the reasons why writers don't know what's doing it. Because it's very easy in that state to assume that it's either the rip-roaring plot, because, we think in story, but then we see it visually, or the beautiful language. And it's neither. I've seen so many that writing coaches are big people going, that thing about backstory. And it's like, I always think, dude, have you never read a novel? Get your
Yeah.
highlighter out. Show me one with where there's none of that. I mean, I don't understand how you can say that and still have read all these books. It makes no sense. And the reason is because when we're in that state where you're there, you're not realizing that that's what's doing it. You're not even seeing it. I mean, when the writing world says don't give us backstory, they just mean don't do it poorly. Don't give us an info
Yeah.
dump. 100% right there. Doesn't mean it's not.
Yeah, well, the sort of the sometimes in movies they have the narrator kind of come in, or they do flashbacks, like, "Ooh," like
Yeah.
there's a corny ways that people do backstory, which I think have given backstory a bad name.
Yeah.
I mean, I always start my podcast asking people to give me their origin story because I think it's important when you're hearing somebody interviewed and it's important to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Like where. So that to me is my version of backstory. In fact, I'm working on a book about origin stories because I think that's a fascinating sort of quality. People are attracted to origin stories. They're attracted to backstories.
Oh, 100, because it tells you why. I mean, it's like I was just reading an interview the other day in the New York Times with Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was asked
Yeah.
how he feels about RFK Jr. And he said, well, he was up because, Schwarzenegger was married to Marie Shriver. So
Yeah, to a Kennedy. He was in the Kennedy family. Yeah.
and he said, and I never thought of it this way before. He said, he always treated me, first of all, he said he always treated me really well, like a person, like he had respect for me.
Yep.
And so I've always liked him. He said, but when I look at what he's done, I mean, he totally said the whole thing about vaccines, obviously, RFK is
Yeah.
completely and totally wrong and what a whack job. That's a technical term, by the way. But he said, the reason why, he said, think about it. This is a guy who, when he was a kid, saw his uncle assassinated, his father assassinated. There are all these conspiracy theories. There's a government refuses to look at stuff. I mean, it makes complete sense
Interesting.
that this is somebody who would see conspiracy theories everywhere because of his
Yeah.
lived experience. Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Or,
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
yeah. Or
Yeah.
think about Mary Trump's book about Trump. I mean, not that it makes what he does okay, but it's fascinating to see what he grew up and you go,
Where
oh,
he came from.
I see
Yeah.
why. It's not about the what, it's always the why. And the why comes from backstory. Always. Again, as Faulkner said, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past.
Let's put on our writer's hat for a minute. This is all amazing information. I want to see if I can make it somewhat, and it's obviously you've got to get your books because it's all there, but to kind of distill it a bit here. Okay, so you're a writer listening to this. You hear that the importance of the internal story, the importance of backstory. But where do you start? Like, let's say you want to write a book or a novel or a movie. You have like a good, I'm going to do a story about a detective who discovers a murder and then finds out, you have a basically act one idea, right? Like a sort of, I have a conflict that I've thought of. Is that the wrong way to think about story? Like, how do you get yourself excited? Because then you fall into this kind of trap of like, I've got a good story idea. And by story idea, like a good plot idea, but I don't have like a character. So where do you start? Like, how do you know that you're onto something, or what's a good practice to kind of get yourself on the right track?
Okay, well, I think you're absolutely. I mean, the first thing you do have is an idea. Absolutely, that spark of an idea. I think this is what's going. I mean, the last thing you want to do is plot it out. Do not do that. That's
Yeah.
how you end up with a bunch of things that happen. But you want to go, okay. So who is this thing? What point do I want to make? What is the story going to say? Because all stories make a point beginning on the very first page, and they earn that point, scene by scene by scene by scene. So you want to go, what am I writing about? What point do I want to make? Not theme. Never use the word theme because theme
Theme immediately sounds boring,
and what does
or
it
sounds
mean?
like
Right.
school. Yeah.
It's general.
So the point, meaning like, what would be an example of a point? Like,
Like,
I want to make the point that misogyny is alive and well in this country. Whatever it is,
yeah,
like something.
but it's more something about human nature.
Mm.
I want to show that being vulnerable isn't a weakness. Being vulnerable is a strength, and that might be the point. I mean, and again, that's just very. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper as you go forward. But then, since you have that idea, it's stopping right there and going, okay, who is my protagonist? I mean, you want to figure out first what you do want this to be, what you want that point to be, what's going to happen in the most general term is going to cause that character to realize, like, what is that point going to be? But then who is that person? Who is your protagonist? And you want to ask yourself, who are they right before the story starts, very specifically? And then you've got to go, and I use the term origin story, because all protagonists, all characters really, enter the story with two things already fully formed. They've got an agenda. They have an agenda that they walk onto the page with. I remember teaching at UCLA at one point and asking, these writers going, okay, I thought this was a softball question. They were all like
Yeah.
either, they were deep in their novels. I said, what does your character enter the page, enter the story wanting? Not a single person could answer it, and many of them were surprised it was even a question. They enter
Mm.
wanting something with an agenda already before the dark and stormy night that they may have brought on themselves. They also have a misbelief, and that's the most important part, because the
Mm.
misbelief, again, is what we've been talking about. We all have them. We all have defining misbeliefs, and the misbelief is the thing that's been keeping them from getting what they want. And that means going back and writing their origin story. Where did this misbelief come from? Writing it in the first person, when they're the age that it happened, when something happened that changed that worldview that began that misbelief, that then grew and escalated, specifically, not in general, nothing's in general, and complicated, kept them from getting what they want up until this moment where the plot's going to force them to go after it. But to do that misbelief, which is now unconscious, is going to be made conscious again. And it happens again. This is brain science. This isn't a writing rule. This is a life life fact, is that we all have
Yeah.
misbeliefs, and they all come in when we're children. Because when we're children, we're trying to figure out, not to make it sound completely transactional, but what we need to do to get our needs met. And it is life or death. And kid logic is far more sophisticated and far more raw than adult logic because they don't have euphemisms. I mean, so we're looking for, what do I need to do to get my needs met? What do I need to do? How should I act, again, in this society so that mom and dad aren't going to move away and not leave the forwarding address? And they come
Mm.
in early, again, because we come into this world. You think about Maslow's pyramid of needs, right? Abraham Maslow, American psychologist. I think that's about the only thing he's famous for, but everybody tends to know this. Like, it's a pyramid of needs, and at the top is like meaning and connection, and but the bottom, he says, the bottom, the base thing is food, water, shelter. And that's true.
Mhm.
We do need that. But what we need before that is someone who cares enough about us to give us that. So a misbelief isn't something logistic, right? It's not like, I thought the world was flat and I hope you're sitting down because it's actually round. Or, I thought she was my sister and it turns out she's my mother. Someone's got some explaining to do. Those things might be true, but not a misbelief. A misbelief is a misbelief about human nature. Like,
About themselves, a misbelief about about their situation, or about themselves, the misbelief.
it's about human nature. It's about, for
Hmm.
instance, and then that gets inculcated in how they see themselves. Absolutely. I mean, sometimes and sometimes not. It might be something like, the nicer someone is to you, the more they seem like they want to get to know the real you, and they're letting you know they really care about you. What they're really doing is trying to get close to you so they can manipulate you, so they can con you and get something out of you. So be very careful of people who really seem to want to get to know the real you, because they're the ones who are not trustworthy. Now, that's something that a situation could teach someone. And and now, as you can imagine, if you get that inculcated when you're 9, you're going to be misreading people from 9 until when the story starts. Now, that's going to get pushback. It's not like frozen in amber, and now that's just true and there's never pushback. It's not just a logical thing that goes forward. It would get pushback. It would go deeper. It would be challenged. It would pick up supporting misbeliefs as it went through, because it would keep the person from getting the thing they want. And again, I'm being general here because we have to be, because we're talking in general at the moment,
Hmm.
from getting that connection that they're looking for. Often it is about the person. It's in order to be, let's take a flip side one, which is, in order for people to like you, you have to be strong. And to be strong, you can't show any emotion. Because if you show emotion, emotion is a sign of weakness.
Hmm.
If you feel emotion, it leaks out and people see it and they're going to think you're weak. So I am never going to feel any emotion and then I'll be strong and people will like me. That's a misbelief.
Right. That's a
And
misbelief.
and that goes through. And that means when that person starts to feel emotion, they're going to think, "Uh-oh, what's wrong with me? Uh-oh, I'm doing something wrong." Obviously, not true. That's a misbelief.
So this is one of the first steps. You're writing bios of just your protagonists, and you're talking about what they want and what their misbelief was, what is, and sort of when that misbelief came about in their life, like what incident led to that
Yeah, yeah.
misbelief, or
Yeah. Let,
why they misbelieve that thing.
yes and no. It's not a bio. You never want to do a character bio, like ever.
I know that that was one of your myths, the
Ever.
character bios are good. So it's not really a bio, it's more of
No,
a
scenes. You are writing this as a scene. It's not, I mean,
Mhm.
people go, "Oh, it's narrative summary. Here's a, a summary of of my character's, backstory." And it's like, think about what a summary is. A summary is this real thing happened, boots on the ground specifically, and I'm pulling out, some sort of general thing that runs through all of it, and that's it. There's no specific there. There's no legs there. The general, the abstract, the general, the abstract, the conceptual do not exist. We made them up. The only thing that exists are specific boots on the ground. So you are writing a scene that happened in as much detail. Often with writers, it's more detail. And when I say detail, God forbid, I do not mean sensory details. Talk about something that is so overrated when it comes to writing.
Yeah,
I mean, oh my God.
yeah,
Sensory details only matter if they're telling, if somebody's reading meaning into them. Otherwise, who cares? Same thing with body language.
right.
So overrated. You only need body language when your point of view character is reading meaning into somebody else's body language and it's telling them something that that person probably doesn't want them to know. Then totally relevant because someone's reading meaning into it. And the meaning, that's how
Right.
emotion comes onto the page. Emotion doesn't come onto the page vis-a-vis body language because it's general. It doesn't come onto the page vis-a-vis I'm happy, sad, whatever. It comes onto the page vis-a-vis this internal struggle we've been talking about. Like, and I know I'm digressing, but let me finish this digression
Okay,
for a
yeah.
second. It's like emotion comes onto the page like, and I'm going to mangle this and I'll be heavy-handed, but like someone coming home and going, "Oh my God, there's that kitten again. That stray kitten. This is the third time I've heard it in the meow. I can hardly hear it now. And I just so want to take it home and put it in and give it just a little bit of milk. But Mom said if I do, Dad's going to notice. He marks the milk carton. And if there's any more milk taken out, he might beat Mom up again. And I don't know, she's been limping a lot. But this kitten might die and maybe no one would know. Maybe it would be okay." Now, I didn't mention a single emotion there. I didn't
Hmm.
stop and say, "By the way, Dad beats Mom up and Dad's a whatever." I just showed someone in a situation, but you can feel it. I say it to writers all the time.
Right.
Do you want to explain what's happening? Or do you want to put me in their head as they're experiencing it and trying to figure out what to do so I can experience it there with them? So
That's a bit of the show don't tell, right? I don't know if you hate show don't tell.
I hate show don't tell the way that people, that is what show don't tell is. The way people mistake show don't tell is don't just tell me what happened, show it visually. Don't do
Hmm.
that. Don't do that. Because showing visually, you're locking us out. It's general. Show don't tell is don't tell me how he feels. Show me him inside trying to make the decision. It's showing the
Hmm.
internal. We come to
The
see the
internal.
penny drop. We come for the real why somebody's doing things. We come for the why. We come for, I had a student at UCLA who once said, she said, "I know on the surface I look really put together, but inside I'm a raging mess, and I'm trying to keep all of you from seeing it." We come for the raging
Right.
mess. That's
Yeah.
what makes a character likable. That's that other big lie the writing world
Right.
perpetuates of likable means they'd never do anything that makes anybody uncomfortable in polite society. First of all, we don't like those people.
No.
Somebody never
That's
does.
probably why the anti-heroes are so popular.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. And we always wonder, like, if they wouldn't do anything in polite society that people don't like, who do they have tied up in the basement? Because nobody's really like that. So what makes a character likable is that they're relatable, and what makes them relatable is that they're vulnerable.
Right. All right. So once we write these character scenes,
Yes.
what would be a next steps? I don't. I'm probably jumping ahead, but
Hmm.
do you write a story outline at this point?
No, never.
Based on what your character. No, never do that.
Never. A little bit going forward, and you have an idea of where you want to go, but stories are in layers. So I would
Hmm.
say, I mean, you want to know what the ending is. You always want to know. And when I say ending, I don't just
So
mean,
interesting.
and they lived happily ever after. I mean, what is
Yeah.
that aha moment? That place where your story makes
Hmm.
its point. What is that going to be? You do want to know that. Doesn't mean it's written in stone. Nothing is.
You want to know where it's going.
You have to know that. You have to know that. And just
Because
to
some
get,
people do that headlights, whatever,
oh, I
the
know.
El Datro.
Oh, so untrue. I mean, maybe for him, for the rest of us, we drive off a cliff or don't know where we're going. We start writing
Yeah.
really pretty. I mean, yeah, it's iterative. You're going to go back and forth and back and forth. It's layers.
So you want to know the aha moment going in.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, totally. And every scene has an aha moment. But the other thing is then you do need to know the other characters, especially to say you had started this by saying, what if you have an idea about a detective and they're going to come in and solve a crime? People will do that. They'll go, I'm starting on page one, writing forward. You're going, I'm thinking, how can you have someone solve a crime and you don't know what it is or who did what or where the bodies are? Like, how can you do that?
Yeah.
You have to know all of that before you go in. You have to know what balls are in play or what's going on. Like
So
I'm
isn't that an outline though? I mean,
no, no,
is,
because that's
no. So
general. That's what happened. You got to know why. No,
hmm.
it's not. Hunter, who did what to
Okay.
who? Why? Oh, it's never an outline. If all you know
Okay.
are actions, you don't know anything. If all you,
Right.
because you know what happened, but you don't know why. And the problem, I say this to writers all the time, beware of simple declarative sentences. It is easy to say, well, so and so, I was working with somebody, we've worked for a while, and it takes place in World War II, and,
Hmm.
American soldier or a flyer is going to be flying, and he's not supposed to be on the plane, but he is, and it gets shot down, and he's in Switzerland, and now he can't go back because if you were in the Swiss, you were not allowed to leave because Switzerland was supposed to be neutral, which it wasn't, but whatever.
Hmm.
And she goes, yeah, and he gives a fake name, and that's how blah blah blah. Simple declarative sounds good, right? He doesn't want to say who he is. He gives.
Yeah.
Finally, we went. Well, wait a minute. There'd be a manifest. They knew who was on there,
Hmm.
and they're looking for him. And the minute he gives a fake name, they would know that that that's a fake name, and they would look for him immediately. That doesn't make sense. But simple declarative sentence sounded true. You got to go down
Hmm.
deeper. You can't just say outlines are worthless. They are not going to get you
So
anything.
so the aha moment? Do you write that down? I mean,
Oh
I
yeah.
guess I'm trying to be very like
Oh, please
linear
do.
here.
No,
Okay, so do you write down the aha moments of every chapter or?
no, that you go for, you can't. But I would say you go
Hmm.
maybe 5 scenes ahead. I like to use those. I made in Story Genius these story cards, so because it's
Yeah.
very easy then to only focus on what your protagonist does, and then every other character becomes a plot puppet. So they're going to do whatever
Right.
needs to happen in the plot, and that's a problem with outlining. Very quickly, it becomes like it's like a race. It's like how fast can I
Hmm.
get the
To
plot
get to.
point, and then you're just writing pretty stuff. I mean, you got to know in every scene what each character's agenda is. Every character, and it isn't just that they go in with an agenda in that scene, because the scene is a unit of story. Every character, down to the barista at Starbucks, has a story long agenda they walk onto the page with. And scene by scene by scene by scene, they're trying to bring that agenda to fruition. So you know what that is. So, in that scene, what do they want? What are they trying to bring to fruition? So you're not going to have them do something because the plot needs them to. And that's what gives you the layers in the story. It's easy to do that, especially when people write thrillers and they've got all of these bad guys out there, but they don't know what they're doing. And they've got armies out there, but they don't know what the army's doing. So if they don't know what's happening there, how do they know what their main character is having to deal with or what would happen? I'll tell you my favorite line of any line in anything ever. Can I
Hmm.
swear? Is it okay to swear?
Yeah, please
Okay.
do. I
Then I'll
enjoy
say it the way
swears.
he actually said it. I usually don't. It's Tony Soprano. I love The
Hmm.
Sopranos. Talk about a great show. He
Yep.
says it's in the finale of the fifth season, an episode actually called, No Due Respect. And he's saying to Sel, who's trying to get him to whack Tony B, and he doesn't want to do it. And he says, all due respect. That's what it's called, all due respect. He said,
Hmm.
all due respect. Every decision I make affects every facet of every other fucking thing. And in the end, you're all alone. And in the end, you're all alone with it. It's too much. It's too much almost. And in the end, you're all alone with it. I say that to writers all the time. Every decision you make affects every facet of everything else. That is why writing is hard. There are so many layers in each scene. If you just write forward and you've got a bunch of things that happen, that's all you've got. a bunch of things that happen. And I can tell you from reading thousands of manuscripts, that is what most manuscripts are. Because writers are told, you learn these writing techniques, it's not about writing. And then you unleash your creativity, and if the muse comes, you have the talent, a story appears. It doesn't work that way. You've got to create these other layers. And then all of it comes in. It's not, like I said, it's not pre-writing. It's not, research. This is writing. This is what's in the novel. Get out that highlighter. See how much backstory is there. So this isn't wasting time. But you're writing scenes from
Right.
the origin scene on up, several scenes. I mean, in Story Genius, I said 3. I think it's more than that usually. I just had to pick a number, right? Two's too few, four's too
Yeah.
many, three's the magic number. But you're looking for turning point places where that misbelief grew, where it caused the character to, take a turn that either served them well at that moment or didn't. So you've landed them there, on page 1, where the plot's now going to hopefully disabuse them of that misbelief or not, depending on where you want to go. There's
Yeah.
some stories where the character doesn't have a aha at the end, and that very few, but that's the point.
This sounds hard. I mean, I know that writing is
It's
hard,
hard.
right?
It's hard.
It it's hard, and yet people do it. Why do we do it?
I think because because we have something to say, because we want to change the world. I mean, you can change. One of the biggest lies we hear out there is that notion of mindless entertainment, right? You hear that all the time. Mindless entertainment. There's no such thing. Stories, we're being affected by stories every minute of every day, whether we know it or not, and mostly we don't. We want to change how people see the world. That's what we want. And it's really worth it. And it's hard, but it isn't. That's why my feeling is if you can break it down into these steps I'm talking about and do this, it isn't as hard as it sounds. It's hard if you think, oh my God, take everything I've just said, now start on page 1 and just write forward but do all those things. Yeah, I don't think you could do that. I mean, unless you have, that's why I say never listen to successful writers ever, because they're going to tell you their process, and many of them have a natural sense of story, the way some people have perfect pitch. They could write a laundry list and you're sobbing over the plight of poorly sorted socks. They just got that thing. Doesn't make them better writers at all, but it just means that
Right.
all these layers come to them at once. But it doesn't mean it can't be boring. I mean, Stephen King, I love some of his books. And I'll tell you, I can't tell you how many times I've tried to read Insomnia, but it puts me to sleep every time. It's like, can't something happen already?
The irony.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the irony.
No, I sometimes struggle with Stephen King. I think I just started listening to one I was trying to listen, and it couldn't penetrate it. But yet sometimes I love his books, so
Yeah,
it's
me
it's
too.
definitely hit or miss.
Yeah, I loved Billy Summers. I loved that book.
Yeah, but I read the one about the gunslinger,
Oh, well,
the
yeah.
Western one he did.
I
I
know.
couldn't get into that
Especially
one,
the
and I like Westerns.
yeah.
Like I love Lonesome Dove; it's one of my favorite
Me
books.
too. My
But
favorite of all time.
really,
I love Logan.
yeah, that's the greatest
Love
book in the
it.
world. Now that book, I was trying to think when you were talking about what it is about that Larry McMurtry does there with inner conflict and with
It's all the way
what
through.
was the misbeliefs. There's a lot of character, right? All the misbeliefs of
Yeah.
all the different characters. What does Cal believe? What is yeah, I mean, I'd have to go back and really think about it. I haven't, but
It's
it is
there.
interesting. Like the books that you love,
Yeah.
just to figure out what their characters, given the framework that you've
Yeah.
established, you're like, what?
That's a tough one. And the other thing to think about, because it is, especially when you get to the end, and I can't remember the names of the characters at all, but the guy who, at the very end, where he
Yeah,
can't even say that to his son. And I mean, it is so there. But also, it's kind of like what you like. I love Westerns. I love them. I love the
yeah,
West.
I do
So I
too.
was so drawn to that book. And just the way he described, I always think of that place where they all were and there was no shade at any time. It's like 110. It's like, how did they live? I think
Yeah,
about that all the time. Or I loved The Goldfinch. And part of it was I lived in New York City.
I love that book too.
Yeah, my kids
Yeah,
went to those private schools. I knew every
hmm
place she referenced. It was like, oh, I was trying to
yeah,
figure
felt
out
very familiar.
what school was it, Horseman? What school is she talking about there? I don't know. But
Did you grow up in New York? We didn't talk about
no,
that.
I grew up here, but I lived
Were you
20 years off and on in New York as well. So,
okay? Because I went to Hackley, which is near Horace Mann, and yeah,
uh,
it was. So yes, I can totally relate to Donna Tartt. My mother went to Bennington.
yeah,
I that whole world. Yeah. Well, now I need to know which books you like because two of your favorite books are two of my favorite books.
yeah. Oh God,
What's your third favorite?
God, that's a good. The one I teach, I don't know that I have a third favorite because those two. In fact, Lonesome Dove. It's funny. I read it because my agent said it was her favorite book, and she said the first time
Yeah.
she tried to read it, she couldn't. The second time, and then I had the same experience because she put it in my head.
It's so hard to penetrate it in the beginning. It's kind of like The Wire.
Yeah, oh
It
yeah,
takes a little while. When I
exactly.
tell people to watch The Wire, the
Me
first episode of The Wire is hard to understand,
too.
and then you just get sucked in. As there's some point at The Wire where it hooks you, and you're just like,
Yeah.
"This is the greatest show I've ever watched in my life." But most people can't get past the first or second
Because they're
episode.
so
So anyway,
writerly. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I see
yeah,
that
it's very right.
exactly the same thing. But my
And Lonesome Dove is also really hard. He talks about the pig, and it's like
yeah,
it's an endless. I don't know how because one of the things you say in your book is that you have to hook the reader early on,
yeah.
and it's funny because he doesn't really do that. But then if you stick with it, it's
Yeah, it's
oof.
just he has that.
So what's one you teach in your class?
I like Celeste Ng's first book, Everything I Never Told You. I think is
Oh,
really good for writers to read it. Again, not in the first person. I happen to love first person books. Not in the first person. I think it's got 5 POV characters. First line is Lydia is
mm.
dead, but they don't know this yet. It's just each character really
I like her
has their
writing. I
own.
haven't read that one.
Yeah, I think it's better.
Yeah.
I couldn't read. I tried to read Little Fires Everywhere, and it was too precious for my taste.
See, I like that
Yeah,
one. Okay, so Celeste things. Okay, so I'm
that's
excited now to read that one.
much better because she changed horses in midstream in that one, and I felt like I could figure out what was going on way too well. It was heavy-handed. I'm not a lover of literary fiction. I think literary fiction is so much navel gazing. I just
Mm.
can't even look at it. I think
Yeah, I
Ulysses
don't like it
is
either
one of the
sometimes.
worst books ever written, and I'm happy to say that out loud.
Which one is? Oh,
Ulysses.
Ulysses.
You know why people liked it? I mean, it's just like, do you want to read a do you want to read a book where the last 15 pages is nothing but $50 words with no punctuation? Like, why would people they
Yeah,
like it because it's
it's
hard,
annoying.
because it makes them feel like it's. But let's be honest. The real reason that book stuck around is because it had dirty bits in it that nobody could say. That's why people like Ulysses. It went on trial for having sex in it.
Right, right, right,
It was
right.
that, and it just stuck around because it's a hard read. Yeah, not a fan of James Joyce. Um,
All right. Me either. So that's another thing we agree on. And I'm glad to hear that because I had to read the Dubliners in
oh,
one of my English literature classes, and it was like painful for me. Now I'm probably going to get some letters about that, but I just can't. And my wife and I disagree on this because she seems to kind of gravitate more towards literary fiction, and I tend to love. But see, what confuses me is I think why I love a lot of these books is because I think they're great stories. For example, Lonesome Dove has a great story.
yes.
But I guess what I'm not realizing, the lie that I'm sort of believed, is that what I'm really responding to, and what my brain seems to be responding to, is this sort of internal. Is that kind of what you're
That is the
saying?
why.
Yeah,
Absolutely,
the why.
100%. The why is if that wasn't there, if you were just watching them, show don't tell, from the outside, and you were never in their heads, and you never were in the why they're doing what they're doing, what it means to them specifically, you would
You
not,
wouldn't
you
care.
would not care.
Because there's a part of me that just loves, as a Jew, maybe a Jew from Westchester County, New York, loves the idea of being a cowboy in the 1870s.
Is
I
that
just love
true?
being in their saddle,
Me too.
traveling up to Montana or wherever they're Wyoming or wherever they're going. But I guess yeah, so that's really interesting.
Yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely, positively. So there is all of that as well. But if it didn't have the other, you literally would not be there. You are reading that in always. Good writer, that
yeah,
is always there. And especially if you're just starting out, it really. That's why the Celeste Ng book I teach from. It really
I can't wait to read
to
that.
go. Yeah,
Yeah,
I thought it was, and it's the shortest one. I think it's only like just 300 pages, not long.
right.
Um,
Well, Lisa, this is so interesting. If people want to find out more about you, you're a consultant too, right? People can work with you.
That's what I do. That is, I do that
Yeah,
from
that's all you.
morning to night. Yeah,
Wow,
I am on the
I want to work with you
I'm on the phone. I'm on the phone often, like
all day.
8 hours.
And you also teach at UCLA?
No, not anymore. I taught in the writers program there, and
Mm.
I used to.
I took a class there.
Yeah, yeah. I taught there. When the pandemic hit, I stopped, and honestly, financially, it just literally isn't worth it. I also taught for a while at the School of Visual Arts in New York in their MFA program in visual storytelling,
Oh,
and
cool.
that was fun. But I
I
just
took
couldn't
that
go
is
to New
fun.
York for
I
summers.
took a class at the School of Visual Arts. Yeah,
Well, that's
but I took a film editing class. I took a film editing class And then the next year, computers came around. Like I took
Oh,
a film editing class where we literally were cutting film
yeah.
and then whatever Adobe
Yeah,
came out
I
with.
remember those.
But all right. So if people want to find out more about you, where do they go?
Just my website. I mean, you can Google me. A ton of stuff comes up. It's just wiredforstory.com is me. Mhm.
Wiredforstory.com.
That's easy.
Fascinating stuff. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. It was fun.
And me. Thank you. Yeah, that was fun. All right, that was awesome. Thank you
Yay.
so much.
My pleasure. That was really fun. So